Sonny Michelle was on one side, Nick Chubb on the other. And I was one of the few people that covers Georgia. There weren't a lot of people in the room to begin with. I was one of the few people that covers Georgia that was in the room after Georgia lost the national championship to Alabama. That cold, rainy, nasty night in 2018 in Atlanta. And I want to revisit something that Kirby said because, in that in the pantheon of disappointing moments at Georgia, and there have been plenty over the years, over the decades, and frankly, that's the case for everybody in college football. Nobody just runs through national championships. Doesn't happen. Think about how disappointing 2021 was for Alabama, I'm sure, or losing to Clemson on the last play of the game, or the way that Clemson got blown out by LSU, or losing to Alabama in the last quarter of the game in 2016. I mean, everybody loses. Everybody has a hard time. But for Georgia, after going 40 plus years without playing for a national championship, watching the clock, die in Atlanta in 2012 at the Dome after completing a pass. 2017 was rougher than that. I mean, that game was for the national championship in 12, but in 17, we weren't halfway through Mark Richt's time at Georgia. We were in game like 30 for Kirby. We wasn't even game 30. We were in the second season. And even though it was an older team, you could tell Georgia was just getting started. And Kirby, I can't remember when it was in the press conference. I don't think it was at the end, but it wasn't at the beginning either. He's just kind of, he obviously he has a plan when he sees microphones and cameras. And it's tough because after everything that went into that game, you got to think about that season was they got blown out by Auburn is the way I put it. At Auburn, and then of course they had to climb back and they blew Auburn out. Same basic score, I think it was. There's a fewer points scored, but the same margin of victory as some same universal margin of victory. And they had survived Oklahoma, a game that they should have lost before they should have won it, and then they had to go win it in overtime. I mean, Georgia was definitely the better team and should have closed it out in the third quarter and fourth quarter. And you had a fumble recovery for Sony that for Oklahoma from Sony that took them down the field, and Drake Fromm with easily his best performance as a Georgia Bulldog that fourth quarter with the whole, the drive was on the line. I still have not watched that game. There's a few of these games I've not watched on television. One of them is the Rose Bowl. One of them is the 2021 National Championship game against Alabama. I think I saw TCU, and now I saw all these in person. Don't get me wrong, but going back and watching it on TV and seeing the way that y'all watch it. But when you're underneath the bowels of the Mercedes-Benz, the setup is different than for an SEC championship game or for a Chick-fil-A Peach Bowl game or for the Chick-fil-A kickoff games or Aflac, whatever they're called now. It's all set up slightly differently. So we're in a different room than Georgia usually goes. And, Kirby was saying, it was like a smaller room almost, but Kirby was saying, we're not going anywhere. And that was of no consolation to these Georgia folks. None. They felt like that was probably true, but that was of no consolation. They didn't want to hear that. They wanted to just go win the national championship. And they didn't. And I don't know if they felt further away than they had, or that it was just cruel to see that happen to them again. You're in the same place, basically, different structure, but Atlanta, same opponent, Alabama. Georgia's watched against Alabama, I would say in 12, 14 for sure, probably 23, and then 12, 17 for sure, 23 have watched national championships fade away. One of them was actually in the national championship game, but certainly in 12 they would have won the national championship. 17 they would have won the national championship. Would they win the national championship this past season? We'll see. I mean, I think they'd have a pretty good shot. They'd have been favored. But when he said that, and Nick and Sony have been, there have been plenty of tears, and he had to make sure that people knew and realized just how far Georgia had come, but B, how much further they had to go. They didn't play for the national championship again until 21. So you went through 18, losing to Alabama in that game again. Well, in the SEC championship game, losing to LSU in the SEC championship game in 19. In 20, you don't even play for it. But then they won that game against Cincinnati. And, from that game on, and, the Cincinnati game kind of on, Georgia was not beatable in many ways. I mean, Bama got them in Atlanta, and then Georgia got Bama by 15. So it was hard, I know, for people to hear that at the time. But he was right. He was right. He was saying, we're not going anywhere. This is not something that's just going to be what he started saying. We're not going to be a one-hit wonder. But I think what he was saying at the time was, we're not going anywhere. And he was right. I mean, if Kirby leaves right now, like if something happens, gets hit by a bus behind me, his legacy at Georgia will be a significant one. No coach that Georgia claims, I should say, has won 2 national championships. He's the only one. Vince didn't win 2. They don't claim the 1968 national championship, nor should they. But like 46 and 27, they should totally claim those national championships. Those are legitimate national championships, and they won them, and they should claim them. But that's another story for another time. I don't think, even though we're 9 years into this, I don't think Kirby thinks about legacy. But when you look back, and as a photographer, the bulk of the way I consume games is through images and imagery and things sometimes y'all don't even see that I take pictures of, that I just don't feel, I wouldn't say comfortable, but that I release them maybe once and that's it. But you got to think about all the moments since Georgia lost that national championship that the Dogs have had. One pops into my head immediately. It wasn't anything unbelievable, but Jake Fromm finding Terry Godwin to go up big against Florida in 2018. I mean, that Florida team in 18 was supposed to be a team that challenged Georgia. Thinking back a year later, finding Eli Wolf on a third and relatively long, I can't remember how long it was, but relatively long, to cinch that game up. Winning in the Sugar Bowl in 19 after having such a bad game in 18. The Cincinnati game was a huge game for Georgia. People say sometimes games don't matter from one season to the next, and that game did not matter, but it gave Jack Benesley some serious credibility in that locker room. We're blasting that to win the game. Like, the game was on the line. You either win or lose. And they stole that game because of some other stuff, but they just started just kept winning big games. And then, of course, the win over Clemson, which was much harder than probably it should have been, but they had to grind that out. Sometimes you got to do that in games. You think about in 21 the way they destroyed Arkansas, a top 10 team, the win at Auburn, the win over a really tough Kentucky team, the way that they recovered from the loss to Alabama to smash Michigan. Oh my gosh. And then, of course, to win the national championship against Alabama, to follow that up with an undefeated season with blowout wins over Oregon, frankly, everybody in 15 that wasn't named Missouri. And then maybe the game of Kirby's time, which was the Ohio State game. I know the Oklahoma game, that's atop a lot of people's list. I know Alabama in 21, that's atop a lot of people's list. The Ohio State game was epic, just as a game. And it was one of the great sporting events I've seen live. And I've seen a lot of sporting events. I've played a lot, which none of those were great, but And then, you watch sports live, Final Fours, College World Series, the Masters, Kentucky Derby, all that stuff. I've got all sorts of people trying to get me off the airwaves here, but that game was amazing. And it all came after his big comment about we're not going anywhere. They haven't, and I think they're not going anywhere this season either.